I have a wide range of YouTube channels that I watch. I put in my earbuds, fill up my watch later list, set up my phone, hit play, and get to folding laundry, filling the dishwasher, sweeping the floors, or whatever else I need to do around the house. One of the channels that I listen to when I have time is modern day debate. One of my guilty pleasures on this channel is listening to debates between those that believe the earth is flat and those that believe the earth is round. Now, I trust that the world is round. I have lived my whole life in the valley of the Columbia River, between the Rocky Mountains and the Cascade Mountain Range. I may not be able to prove that the earth is round, but I sure as chocolate pancakes know it isn't flat. What's more, as a teenager, I've stood at the timberline of Mount Rainier on a clear day, and the Cascades look like they're at my feet, but from the Cascades, Rainier looks like it is below me. To me, this makes more sense on a round earth than a flat earth. Now, if the scholarly consensus in cartography was that the earth is flat, they would be able to explain this discrepancy in perception. In fact, flat earth debaters have offered explanations. There are other cases of perception where the flat earth theory makes as much sense or more, and the globe earth believer has to explain why something is visible beyond where the curve of the earth should be or the way a distant object appears. Usually the explanation involves refraction of the air. One of the things that I've been impressed by is the general reasonableness of the flat earth debaters. They have noticed small problems in the data available to them, inconsistent propositions that pop up over and over, and they've pressed on them. They often have a view of the world that's, as near as I can tell from the debate, internally consistent. They've reached a place where they don't trust government authorities or big businesses. They rely on what they can see with their own two eyes or data they can gather themselves. They put this together independently and without consulting the experts because the experts are all on the payroll of the government they don't trust or the big businesses they don't trust. Honestly, in that one sense, I'm not too far off from them. You're not likely to hear me praising the virtues of government or big business. I'm the first one to say that the reason I don't trust the news is because it's so often wrong. In fact, in a recent evaluation, it was discovered that the news is far more likely to report on scientific or academic papers that will either fail in replication or fail in peer review. I totally understand and even sympathize with the skepticism the flat earth believer has towards the media, big business, government, and common education. I don't take it nearly to the level they do, but I sympathize. We have a strange habit in 21st century America. We assume that everyone that disagrees with us is unreasonable. There's a hubris in that which I would very much like to be critical of, if that criticism didn't automatically turn into hypocrisy. Intellectually, I recognize that everyone is going to be exposed to different data, and those data are going to lead to different conclusions. Emotionally, I find the particular emphasis that some people place on certain data to be very strange. But I don't have complete access to their complete data set. It might make more sense to me if I did. Last week, a poll showed up in one of my Facebook groups, but it was taken down before I could answer. The question was, if a person has access to all the data, can they still reasonably conclude atheism is true? Or something like that. I wanted to give a nuanced answer, but they took it down before I could write one. So this is me getting that out of my head. This is where more than half of my blog posts come from. A conversation, blog post, YouTube video, or Facebook post that I can't do justice in its native habitat, so I bring it here to unpack it. For that reason, this is going to be very stream of consciousness. I'm sorry if that makes it hard for some people to follow. If you haven't gathered by now, I do think there are reasonable atheists out there. There are also unreasonable atheists out there. For me, I'm far more interested in internal self-consistency than conforming to any particular external standard when I'm judging how reasonable someone is. One of the ways that I work to try to keep myself internally consistent is to compare like to like. To that end, I compare the resurrection of Jesus to the Third Servile War led by Spartacus. If someone is going to reject one, but not the other, then it's not because of the evidence. The evidence is very similar between the two. But and that is the key. Someone might reject both. Dr. Bart Ehrman has mentioned a few times that he doesn't think history before the 4th century AD can be reliably reconstructed. If someone were to bring up the comparable evidence between Spartacus and his 3-year rebellion and the resurrection of Christ, Dr. Ehrman could be completely self-consistent and say that he doesn't think that the Third Servile War was actually a thing, and go on to suggest that Spartacus was a real slave that tried to escape and got killed leaving Rome, and that the whole thing probably lasted 3 hours instead of 3 years, and that the story grew because it happened to be an influential general that killed him, and he wanted a better story than just, "I had an archer shot the slaves as they tried to escape." To be clear, to the best of my knowledge, Dr. Ehrman has not actually expressed any doubts about the Third Servile War specifically, nor is this the only way he might choose to try to address this particular point. It's a thought experiment on one option of the things someone with Dr. Ehrman's thoughts on the subject might say when presented with that particular challenge. I've never heard Dr. Ehrman address this particular point, and so I don't know how he would actually respond to that position. If the system is internally consistent, I'll call it reasonable, even if I disagree. I have my reasons for thinking that even ancient history is more reliable than Dr. Ehrman thinks it is, but he no doubt has reasons for thinking it's not. The question when drawing these things out is always, how deep do we go? And it always has to stop somewhere. Eventually we run out of time or energy or both. Another point relates back to what I said about the flat earth believers. They don't trust the authority. And very similar to that point, I also don't trust authority. Explanations and excuses aside, one thing that people in my camp have to admit is that there are an awful lot of groups out there that jump right from God exists to obey everything I tell you, give me all your money, etc. The same is true of the medical industry. Snake oil salesmen were all over once, and the rows of over-the-counter herbal supplements are generally regarded with skepticism by the medical establishment today. The way that the African American community has been treated by the medical establishment has led to wide-scale distrust. Frankly, even if I were given dictatorial powers over a cult, I'd still be skeptical of the motives and intentions of the guy in charge. So when someone says that they don't believe in God and start rattling off the names of pastors that have lied both to them personally and to large audiences, I get what they're saying. There's a very real sense in which I think they're approaching the question from the wrong angle, but I've also never been lied to by either a childhood doctor or a childhood pastor. It might change my perspective if I were. From where I sit, it seems like a lot of people in the African American community are passing up good, quality medical care and advice just because they've given in to fear. And similarly, many atheists have given up on the idea of good spiritual advice for the fear that they might be misled. As a father of a special needs child who has a genetic condition that went undiagnosed for the first 5 years of his life, I have all the reasons one would need to be skeptical of the medical community. I was given conflicting advice for half a decade, and now that we have a more robust community of supporters familiar with our son's condition, I can confidently say that the first 5 years of his life were characterized by 3 to 5 competing, conflicting sources of advice from medical professionals, often with all of them being suboptimal to his actual condition. But I didn't get to this point by giving up on the medical community. I got to this point by sorting through the medical community, getting more data, and following the experts that were following the evidence. That's the policy which seems to me to be most fruitful not only in my own life, but in general. But I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again, and if I'm not, then I was just wrong. Maybe it's not the best policy. And I'm not really sure how to determine that in a way that would satisfy both those that agree with me and those that disagree with me. Then, there are more foundational concerns. How someone approaches a question can often determine how they see the answer. There are still a lot of apologists and theologians that approach God through ontological or cosmological arguments. There are still a lot of pastors and gurus that teach that God is there to answer our prayers. There are still a lot of movies and comics that portray God as some kind of alien or really powerful human-like being. If someone starts out thinking that God is the origin of the universe, then they get fluent in Big Bang cosmology. They become the kind of person to say, "I've looked into the origin of the universe, and I don't need God anymore." Similarly, if they've always seen God as the one that answers prayer, and they have a tragedy that they really prayed about, and the logical inconsistency of the God in a show like Lucifer or Bruce Almighty can leave someone with a lot of unanswerable questions. If that's where I had started in my search for God, I think I'd be agnostic as well. That's one of the things that I think modern apologetic gets wrong. It turns out that the way we can answer some of these deep questions has changed since the 16th century. It could be that the necessary being is the electroweak field. The unmoved first mover could be the Big Bang. And such and so on. If their God is the God of the ontological argument, then their God might be the electroweak field. If their God is the unmoved first mover, then their God might be the Big Bang. To be clear, I think that the unmoved first mover that started the Big Bang and the necessary being from which fundamental fields spring is the moral substrate of the moral argument. I also admit that the evidence for that is still kinda sketchy and embedded in design arguments, which too often are taken as proof for God rather than the connecting evidence between otherwise competing arguments. But here's the thing. Since the two arguments that were given to me first were variations on the moral argument and the historical argument for Jesus, I kind of don't care if the unmoved first mover is the Big Bang. Even if I'm wrong, even if the unmoved first mover and the moral substrate of the moral argument are not the same thing, I call the unmoved first mover God because I thought it was the same as the moral substrate, not the other way around. The thing I find interesting is that I've never had anyone describe to me what the difference between the moral substrate and God is. Whenever I ask an atheist this, they either say that it's not the object of the ontological argument or the cosmological argument, or they just declare, "No God is needed." When I point out that I didn't say it was, but that I'm asking for a name and a distinguishing characteristic, they can never provide one. On the other hand, even though I rarely ask, they're full of abundant reasons why the God of the ontological argument is more likely to be something like the electroweak field or the God of the cosmological argument is likely to be something like the Big Bang. And their reasons are definitely self-consistent. So since the apologetic and evangelistic arm of the church is so focused on the cosmological and ontological arguments, it is no wonder these points fail. Further, while I have good reasons for being a moral realist, I've heard good, self-consistent reasons to think that morality is not objective. A moral relativist is going to reject the idea of a real moral substrate, and for them, the moral argument takes more effort, which leads naturally into the next kind of religious skepticism that I find reasonable. It's not one that I encounter often, but it flows naturally here. Some of the things in the Bible don't fit well into our modern pragmatic culture. Killing people for gathering firewood on the Sabbath, but letting slave owners marry their slaves sounds backwards to us today. There are those who read these ancient codes and say something to the effect of, "This cannot be the moral substrate." Similarly, people will look at the history of popes, crusades, Atlantic slave trade, and or other atrocities ancient and or modern and decide that whatever substrate is behind those, it isn't the moral substrate. There's a real sense in which these people believe in the God of the moral argument, they just don't believe that it is the God of the Bible or the God of the church. I actually wish more people like this would go into theology. It's questions like this that have advanced theology in the past. The church has had popular theological opinions overturned in the past with points very much like these. Whatever someone thinks about God, that's open to discussion. The chances that anyone coming up with something truly unique is small, so the one proposing a new way to look at theology should be ready to shape their beliefs to accommodate the reasons that similar thoughts have been rejected in the past. Is there some new insight from philosophy or archaeology or physics that supports a new way to look at things? And be conservative in your declarations. If someone were to definitively demonstrate that Darius the Mede is a fictional character, that only proves that one of the chapters in the Bible is fiction, not that the whole Bible is unreliable. We already have chapters that are known to be largely fiction. Matthew chapter 25, for example, is mostly a series of parables, and I don't think that Jesus has 10 particular bridesmaids or 3 particular investors in mind, and describing the saved and the damned as sheep and goats is imagery, and I don't actually think we are transformed into farm animals at the judgment. The skeptic that makes the case that Daniel 9 is deliberately fictional is going to be interesting to listen to, particularly if they maintain that level of nuance in their presentation. Less nuanced positions that claim that because there is one chapter of fiction the whole Bible must be lies are less interesting. Similarly, demonstrating that a church has failed to follow God doesn't prove they have the wrong God. At times, it may be that they are following the wrong God, but they may have the right God and fail to follow Him as well. On a similar note, there are a lot of mainstream or conservative Christian beliefs that I don't put much stock in at all. I don't find that any of the available accounts of heaven or hell are compatible with my view of eternity in general or my view of the human soul in particular. Any one of them could work as an analogy, and I find many of them to be similarly compatible with the teachings of Scripture. But I still see shadows of this life in the particulars of every system that I doubt carry over. So if someone is skeptical because they don't think a particular view of the afterlife is compelling, I kind of get that. It feels like they give up a lot for a little to me, but I also know that some pastors put a lot of emphasis on either heaven or hell or both, and I can understand the feeling when the view someone grew up with ends up being less compelling as an adult than it was as a child. The same style of objection can also be applied to a wide range of beliefs, at least in theory, which flows naturally into another kind of objection. There are some issues, like the afterlife, where there is a diversity of opinions with no majority, and not even a clear plurality. Some people get stuck on the idea that you either have to agree to one of them, or stop being a Christian. I don't understand this take at all. This is something that most of us don't apply to any other area of deep study. When we find out that there are competing views of which animals are more primitive in evolution, or competing views on the formation of the moon, we don't abandon biology or cosmology. Except some of us do, some young Earth creationists and some flat Earth believers respectively. I've already discussed how I'm willing to take the flat Earth model as rational if it's internally consistent. If someone rejects a lot of ideas that have multiple explanations in the academic literature, then that's internally consistent. If they only do it in one subject because they don't like that subject, it's special pleading. That same criticism applies equally to those that use this to reject evolution for young Earth creationism as it does to those that use this to reject theism. I think that debate and dialogue are tools that we bring to war on ignorance, but we don't do any good by imagining that those who disagree with us are automatically inferior. Sometimes there's a depth that we need to reach, sometimes there's a definition to overcome, and sometimes there's a point of presuppositions to address. Sometimes these may be beyond us to address. And that's okay.